Stunning. Fantastic. I think the audio is working there. Welcome one, welcome all to Debating Economics 101 as part of the illustrious Dublin Debate Academy. Uh, what is my plan for this debate? What is my plan for this workshop today? I want to run through some very simple concepts of economics, simple to the point where a lot of speakers might think it's too simplified, and I don't care because my opinion is that a lot of the times the basics are missed when it comes to discussing economics. Even if you think these pieces of analysis won't help you win the room, I think these are useful in proving an argument to the best case that it can be, and sometimes that's just as important as winning. Okay, phenomenal. What's the plan? Excellent. There we go. Going to run over motion examples of the ones I'm talking about, overview of what I think an economics debate looks like, the questions you should ask yourself, then running through the very basics of economics, supply and demand, how to apply that in a debate, inflation and interest rates. Stunning. Motion examples. Simplest ones to isolate and identify are the three ones that are used at recent Euros. This is slightly annoying because in my opinion, the ones from 2024 and 2023 are pretty much the same, but it's still useful to have them on hand. And I'll try and refer to these back as much as possible throughout the workshop. Okay, phenomenal. I think there's a very simple question to ask yourself three simple questions to ask yourself whenever an economics debate comes up. Does this change what people want? Does this change what becomes more scarce and available? And is there an associated narrative? This last one is incredibly important and often so overlooked when it comes to debating economics. The reason for this, as any economist will tell you, is humans are deeply irrational, consumers even more so. So if you can prove within a debate that a certain narrative exists that shapes what people want and what they will do in order to get that, I think you've won the debate before bringing in any sort of economics jargon. There will be so many times throughout this workshop that I will say like, this encourages consumption or this incentivizes saving. And that is good as a theory, but the thing that ultimately activates those incentives or activates those preferences is the narrative that comes with an economic change, whether that's in the news, whether that's in the media, whether that's people on forums or whatever. So even though I might focus heavily on the economic jargon in this workshop, just keep in the back of your mind that the way to activate any of these, in my humble opinion, is with a narrative that comes along with them. Stunning. To the basics. Supply and demand. This background photo was the first thing that showed up when I looked up this image on Google Slides. So apply it to carrot and celery, if you would so like, in these examples. What is supply? Supply is the amount of goods a seller is willing to sell at a given price. So example, at Christmas, more butchers sell turkeys, therefore supply is said to increase during the Christmas period. It basically means that more people are willing to sell things. This is important to note because supply is influenced but distinct from abundance. I don't know if abundance is like the academic economic term, but it makes sense in my mind. Abundance describes how much of a good is technically available to sell. How much of it exists in the world is another way of phrasing it. So for example, oil and diamonds can be said to be abundant, especially relative to say like nuclear fuel or like other gemstones, which are rarer. But their supply, which is to say how much is sold at any one time or how much is made available to sell, that is often quite restricted. So therefore supply is still said to be limited for these goods. There are a lot of factors affecting supply, and I'll breeze through some of them, but the important thing to take in mind is this, I think, is one of the steps that's most often overlooked when it comes to economics. People just state, and I cannot tell you the amount of times this has infuriated me in a debate, just say like, supply is this, it changes when X, therefore impact of Y. I think in order to properly prove a point, you walk through what exactly the factor is that affects supply. And I'll talk about this later, but in any given debate, you do have to take the extra step of proving why the factor you're talking about is more persuasive or more meaningful in that specific debate than any other factor that might affect supply. Because debating is not a solo game, right? Like you'll have teams saying, no, that factor is meaningless, and you'll have to push back on that. So what are the factors that are affecting supply? One of them is abundance. Typically, the more things there are in the world, the more readily available it is to buy those things, or the more readily available people are willing to sell that thing. Cost of production is probably the biggest determinant and the biggest factor. It's definitely the one talked about most in debating, and it's probably the simplest to prove in debating as well, right? If it costs a lot of money for a shopkeeper to put an item on the shelf, then they're going to charge more money. They're going to charge more money for that. Apologies. That's not the way to phrase it. If it costs a lot of money for a shopkeeper to put an item on a shelf, a lot of them just won't put it on the shelf. Therefore, supply of that item will be limited. And importantly, if the costs of production increase, if they rise, then shopkeepers will put that item on the shelf less and less. So if the cost of production increase, the supply decreases, typically a negative relationship. Income and purchasing power typically have a positive relationship with supply. So income is how much money is coming into an individual's account. When I say income, I mean on a personal level, but I also mean on an aggregate level. So on like an economy-wide level as well. If there's a lot of income in a specific country, even if there is inequalities, that likely still looks like suppliers providing more goods. And if purchasing power increases, that's typically the same. That describes how much you can buy with the money. Example of this is like 50 years ago, my granny couldn't buy a mango in Ireland, but now that people have more money in Ireland, you can buy a mango. And I would say that is indicative that as Ireland became richer, more supply for a lot of goods increased. Number of consumers is important, typically a positive relationship between supply and the numbers of consumers. That is to say, if there are more people buying a good, then there are more people willing to sell that good. So if there are a lot of people looking to buy turkey, then supply of that will likely increase as a result. Sellers' expectations is super important and probably one that is under talked about in debating, which is just to say sellers will change sale plans based on new information. So if they think that goods are going to become more expensive, they might decrease the supply for now and then increase it at a later date. And vice versa. If they think goods are going to become cheaper, they probably just won't supply it in the long run because the returns or the profit you're going to make on those goods decrease as well. Taste is the final one. And taste is often really under talked about when it comes to, I'm going to say that about a lot of things in this presentation, but it is, I think. Taste is everything. Taste is culture, taste is trends, taste is influence, taste is everything to decide what people want beyond necessity. So supply of messy shirts increased after Argentina won the World Cup because sellers were aware that people were going to buy them, so they increased supply as a result. So now, demand. Demand is the simpler one to talk about, I think. Demand is the amount of goods a consumer is willing to buy at a given price. So in summer, more people are willing to buy ice cream, therefore demand is said to increase. Important to note that just like supply, there's a wrinkle here. Demand is activated, but distinct from income and purchasing power. Income is just how much money is coming into someone's account or it's coming into someone's I guess being, like how much money they have. Like the way I'm going to talk about it, it's not just your wage, but it's also maybe money you get from loans. So that describes how much money you have coming in, and purchasing power describes how much stuff you can buy with that money. So for example, 10 years ago, I could buy 2 pints in Dublin with a tenner, and now I can barely buy 1 pint in Dublin with a tenner. So my purchasing power for pints has decreased. Stunning. Factors affecting demand. Price of good is the obvious one. Typically a negative relationship. If the price of a good goes up, people tend to want it less. Therefore, demand decreases. We'll talk about that a lot throughout this workshop. Income and purchasing power, typically the same. If income increases, then typically demand for pretty much everything in a country increases as well. Purchasing power, same thing. If my euros can buy more pints, I typically want more pints and I will buy more pints. There's a wrinkle to this for those who know about that relationship, and we will talk about that later. But a general rule of thumb is that that is typically a positive relationship. Necessity is an important one that affects demand. I sometimes don't have a say in what I want. I need a roof over my head. I need medicine. I need food to exist. So that type of demand is typically called inelastic demand, which is to say I will always want it regardless of other factors. Number of consumers is another important one. More consumers means more aggregate demand. So the more people that exist in an economy typically means there are more people wanting things, more people buying things. Finally, consumer expectations as well. This is very similar. This is pretty much just the flip of suppliers' expectations, which is to say, if I think something is going to increase in price, I'm likely to buy it now. Whereas if I think something is going to decrease in price, I will likely buy it later. Finally, taste, trends, styles, etc. Like buying messy shirts didn't really fit into any of the other factors. You have to just infer that that's a thing humans decided they liked after Argentina won the World Cup. Well, before that as well, right? But like that was a big thing when people decided they really wanted messy shirts. Stunning. So this reaches a conclusion. And this is the shit that economists always talk about. The law of supply and demand. The law of supply states that as prices rise or fall, supply increases or decreases. To make that very clear, if prices rise, supply increases. If prices fall, then supply decreases. Law of demand states that as prices rise or fall, demand decreases or increases. So they have an opposite relationship. The conclusion is that any price change will result in supply and demand moving in opposite directions. When some debaters stand up and say, and then an equilibrium is met without explaining how that, like what that equilibrium even is, this is what they're talking about. They say that a price change happens, shopkeepers may want to provide more goods, but consumers want less of those goods. Therefore, they will eventually meet in the middle where a nice equilibrium is met. That is really not often what happens. That is what happens in theory, but as we'll go on to discuss, very rarely is that actually how things play out. And this is the lovely thing that economists usually land on. You can see it graphed there. Important question. Is this useful? I was going to phrase this as, is this true? But what is true is deeply between you and the panel, and I would never take that relationship away from you. Like, so is this useful in debates? Like, can you actually use this analysis to prove arguments, or is it just for like an economics classroom? So here's the applying supply and demand part of this talk. This is the image that came up when I searched up applied economics. So if you ever wonder what economists do, it's point at little stick-it notes. We're gonna apply supply and demand in a specific. I'm gonna walk through how to generate some arguments for supply and demand. We're gonna go with the motion. This house prefers I forget how to pronounce this. Hayekian economic policies to Keynesian economic policies. This is the info slide that associates the motion. I'll let you guys run through that at your own time. There's a very simple. This is an important moment to flag. I think, at least the trend is currently, CAs tend to overcompensate when they set economics motions and just throw word vomit at people. They say, this is what is being discussed. These are all the things that it encompasses there. Have a discussion about that. And while that can be confusing and off-putting for some speakers, it is also very helpful in the fact that you can just immediately point to certainties that exist within that debate. What do I mean by that? So in step one for any of economics arguments is I would recommend simplifying. Identify a few clear changes that the motion is bringing about. This is made a whole lot easier when CAs just do the word vomit thing, because usually they just give examples, and then it's fairly easy to say to the panel, look, this is an example that is stated, therefore that is a concrete change that is being brought about. So for the Hayekian Keynesian economics, let's just isolate specifically minimizing annual deficits. You could, because that is an example, you could technically argue whether it's very prevalent in the debate, but that often doesn't happen in word vomit economics motions. Usually it's just taken for granted that the examples given are the examples playing out in the motion. Just for record, minimizing annual deficits, I've said that at the bottom there, but annual deficit is when a government spends more money than they earn. So minimizing that means the governments try and earn more money than they spend. They can do this by raising taxes, they can do this by cutting spending, or they can do this by increasing the tax base. What I mean, raising taxes is fairly intuitive. You just make people pay more in taxes, whether that be on taxes they pay on goods, whether that be the taxes they pay on their wage, et cetera, et cetera. Cutting spending, that can look like firing government employees. It can look like cutting down the amount of buses that are running. It can look like shelving infrastructure projects, whatever. Increasing the tax base is the one that's less so talked about. That looks like maybe bringing in more people into the country. Therefore, you can tax their income. Creating new jobs. That would be another way to increase the tax base as well, as you get to charge them for the wages they're earning. And then you get to tax the money they spend as a result of those wages too. So that was not simple, but the step one is usually to simplify something really identifiable within the motion. Oftentimes, I suppose I should flag here as well. In the rare cases where CAs don't throw word vomit at you and just say like, this house prefers like free market economics over over centrally planned economics or whatever. In those cases, I'm sorry, but there's no cheat code. You do just kind of have to know that lingo. So I would recommend doing some reading before attending a major debate competition. So step two, take that simple change that you have identified and tie that into a factor of supply and demand. This is why I wasn't just running over my economics notes from like second year of college. I like the running through the factors was important specifically for debating, because this is how you prove it from pretty much the first principles of economics. You take that change and you tie it into a factor of supply and demand. So repeated annual deficits means that a government will have less money to spend on infrastructure, subsidies, education, and healthcare. This is fairly intuitive to prove. Because they are spending more money than they're taking in, that means they have less money in the long term. If you want an extra step to prove this, you can say that as a result of a deficit, governments typically have to borrow money. And as we'll talk about later, borrowing money comes with a cost, that being the interest rate. So not only will they have less money, but now they have to spend some of their money on paying back that interest as well. So ultimately, you just tie in the change into a factor of supply and demand, because repeated annual deficits mean that all these things happen. All of these are factors in a good's cost of production. So infrastructure and subsidies directly lower the cost of transportation, production, etc. If there's like infrastructure, if there's a road being built that makes transport more efficient, that means like producers have to spend less on petrol, etc. Education and healthcare affect the quality of labor, meaning employees will have to spend more money. I shouldn't say uneducated there, as their workforce would be undereducated and their workforce would be sick, and therefore they tend to be less productive. So producers would have to spend more money on hiring more people. That would be a cost of production that increases. As a result of the cost of production increasing, that means therefore minimizing annual deficit means the costs of production increase. Oh, sorry, that should be the opposite. Minimizing annual deficit means the cost of production decrease because more money can be spent on infrastructure subsidies. I will change that before sending these slides out. What that should read at it is increasing annual deficits mean the cost of production increase, and annual deficits full stop typically mean the cost of productions increase. The step third then is you've identified a factor of supply and demand. Prove the factor you have identified has a meaningful impact of supply and demand. It's not enough to just say, hey, I went to a workshop once, I saw that cost of production is a factor of supply, here's how to prove it. You have to prove not only that it's meaningful, but it's more impactful than other factors under consideration. So cost of production, this is how you would argue this, or this is an example of how I would argue this when I was putting together the slides for this. Cost of production are the origin point for the supply of any goods and services. They encompass rent, wages, fuel, transport, raw materials, etc. Oftentimes, they must be paid before the goods and services can be sold. So I have to pay workers before they put items on the shelves that can be sold to consumers. Therefore, these costs must be paid in order for goods to be made available for consumption. Therefore, they are the most important factors affecting supply, as not being able to afford them means goods and services cannot be provided at all, which is obviously dramatically would decrease supply. Therefore, a decrease in the costs of production means an increase in supply. And because we followed this step-by-step analysis, we've already proven that this motion leads to a decrease in the cost of production. Therefore, through this step, we have proven that this motion leads to an increase in supply. Final step, impact that. What are the consequences of the change in demand or supply? Oftentimes in economics debates, you'll get one-liner being the price changes, but that's really simplistic. And I don't think it encompasses all of what you can do with impacting demand and supply. So what we've done in this argument is we've proven that supply increases. So what are the benefits of that? I think it's fairly simple to prove that supply is an inherent good. Like more goods means consumers enjoy more choices from more shops. They enjoy more convenience because if more shops have that item, they don't have to travel as far to buy goods. And they enjoy more peace of mind, which is a really important one. Right at the start of the COVID pandemic, people were fairly stressed and thought that toilet roll would become scarce. So they ran out and bought a lot of it for like fairly no reason. So more supply means there's less panic buying and people can plan their future purchases well in advance and have a more stressless time, which we all like. Another impact is that a knock-on effect of the resultant increase in choices and providers is now that consumers can shop around for better deals, better services, more innovative goods, etc. All of these impacts are dependent on more supply in the market, because if only one shop is selling one type of good, I don't have a choice in what price I pay or what quality that good is. I have to go to that. Where if many shops are selling, I don't know, if many shops are selling many cars, I can have a choice of what color car I want, what specific, I was going to say genre of car it is, what like niche of car it is, and maybe I can get a potentially better deal. That's a knock-on effect of supply. And then finally, an increase in supply can also be proven to result in an increase in tax revenue for the government through more import duties, taxes on raw materials, which in this specific case of the motion also helps alleviate the motion problems of deficit. So that might have been fairly quick, but that's just my four-step process for running through how to tie any change in a motion into a change in supply and demand and then impact that out. So we'll do the same again, but let's do OO on the same motion. So as a reminder, that means we are preferring Keynesian economics. I realize I said that anyways, like right after, but anyways. So simplified, what does it mean? Keynesian economics, as clarified in the motion, so you don't even have to know the spec knowledge, but you should, means quantitative easing. Quantitative easing simply means pumping money into an economy by providing banks with liquidity. I realize I said simply there, and that might be simple to a lot of people. So what basically means is more loans are available in an economy. Factorize that, tie that into a factor of demand or supply. More loans means higher income, as people have more money to spend. When I say higher income, I literally mean here money coming into an account, because that loan does mean there is money in my account now. Specifically, this is usually the case for like big purchases, such as like cars, houses, weddings, education for student loans. Analyze what that means. Higher income usually has a positive relationship with demand. Therefore, higher income means demand increases. And through our simplification and factorization, we have proven that higher incomes, that the result in this motion is higher incomes. Therefore, we prove that the result is that demand increases. Then the final step is to impact this. Increased demand means more people spend more money, resulting in more jobs being created, less government expenditure on welfare, and an increase in government revenue. Those aren't obviously the only two motions you can run, the only two arguments you can run for those motions. But I think they are nice, simple ones to try and tease out how to prove supply and demand, because so often they're skipped over in a debate. Even if you don't need them to win the debate, I would argue you should still prove it from first principles. Like if you're being selfish, it lets you get extra speaks, maybe. The judges will be more persuaded by it. But I just think it's nice to prove arguments out fully. Important. In both those examples, the end impact was that supply increases, and that is good, and that demand increases, and that is good. Is an increase in demand and supply always good? Nah, not always. Supply. When is supply bad? Harmful goods like cigarettes, weapons, etc. You don't want those a huge amount of supply of those in a country. So therefore, you can in a debate prove that supply increases, but prove that supply increases of a specific good or service, and therefore that is bad. I don't know, if you were in a specific debate where you could prove that like the cost of production of producing drugs decreased, therefore the supply of goods in an economy increased, and therefore the impact of that was more people are addicted to drugs and like they hurt themselves or whatever as a result of drug consumption. That would be one way that you prove an increase in supply is bad for an economy. Second is crowding out. If there's a ton of goods in a market, that can often look like predatory sellers undercutting other businesses. This is often what predatory chains like Starbucks or McDonald's do. They open a ton of shops, they flood the market with supply, and therefore, because people are buying a lot of those goods, it just means that either the local chains can't compete, or it just means that people will always go. So say if there's a Starbucks on every corner, even if I prefer, and even if the quality of coffee is better 3 blocks down the road, I don't know why I'm saying blocks. I'm not living in New York. Like even if it's different 3 streets down the road, 3 streets away, I'm likely still go to Starbucks because it's just more convenient as a result of the increase in supply. And then finally, production processes. If you prove that supply increases of a damaging production process, then you're proving that everyone loses out. So vapes, for example, the supply of vapes has increased dramatically as a result of people really liking them. They use rare materials and they also result in a ton of litter. So therefore, the increase in supply of vapes has been a net negative for everywhere, in my opinion. Demand. When is an increase in demand bad? Harmful demand, pretty much the mirror of harmful goods. Desire for weapons, Starbucks, etc. I said Starbucks here flippantly, but like you can prove that desire for a lot of innocuous things is harmful. If you prove that demand for vapes increases, then that could be bad for an economy, or you could prove that that is good, as that leads to a demand decreasing for cigarettes. Resource crunch. So this is my favorite way to prove that demand is harmful. There is just often a finite amount of resources, and those resources are being competed against for separate goods and services because a lot of final goods and services use the same raw materials. So a really good example of this is when crypto mining became really popular, a lot of people bought CPUs, which I completely forget the acronym now for, but there are things used to build computers. As a result of this, it meant demand for CPUs skyrocketed and they became more expensive. This meant that people losing out with people who were buying computers, were buying video game consoles, buying pretty much any sort of electronic device that housed any sort of computing power became a lot more expensive because demand for CPUs increased as a result. So if you prove that a resource crunch happens, this means that either the goods get more expensive, which is talked about later, or that those goods just aren't produced at all because the raw materials are being used for something else. And then finally, demand push inflation, which is to say sellers respond to an increase in demand by increasing prices. This is bad for a whole host of reasons, and we'll talk about that in the second section of this talk, inflation. I think that's a Reagan quote. I think it's quite a good one. Although not always a fan of the man, but he didn't get that wrong. What is inflation? Inflation is the increase in the price of goods and services over a period of time. That's it. That's pretty much all it is. That's my only fancy animation throughout this whole thing. This is a graph of house prices in Illinois. Why did I choose Illinois? My cousins are from there, and I guess that's about it. Important to note, I'm going to put my maths hat on for a moment. This graph isn't, the y-axis on this isn't measuring house prices, it's measuring resultant percentage change in house prices. So in 1980, house prices are set at 100. By 1995, they hit 200, which meant house prices have doubled. But the purpose of this graph is just to show that as prices increase over time, we call that inflation. And sometimes the opposite can happen, where prices decrease over a period of time. That's known as deflation. Stunning. So what causes inflation? We've talked about demand push inflation before, but many consumers chasing few goods means sellers can capitalize by raising prices. Taylor Swift tickets, housing, Bitcoin, etc. This is especially effective when supply is limited and or rising slowly. So if supply is increasing at a slower rate than demand is, then prices are likely to increase more. Supply squeeze inflation. I think this is called supply pull in like economic circles. I think supply squeeze is a more fun term though, which is to say costs of production push up prices for goods and services. If it's more expensive to produce a good, then it is more expensive to sell that good. And as a result, less people produce that good because less shopkeepers can afford to produce it in the first place. So the cost of grain following the Russian invasion of Ukraine is one that gets talked about constantly in debating. Third one is wage growth inflation. As wages increase, sellers capitalize by increasing prices. This is fairly simple. People can afford more things, so sellers capitalize on that by charging more for those people. Not just for those people. Sellers tend to increase prices as a result of broad wage increases, even if some people haven't experienced that wage increase, and they suffer quite a lot. That can come up in specific debates. Finally, consumer expectations, which is to say, if consumers think the prices are going to rise, or that purchasing power is going to drop, they panic buy goods now, which increases the price due to demand push inflation. A lot of inflation just comes down to demand push or supply squeeze. They are really the only two types. It's about identifying which cause is causing it. Because as we'll talk about this later, the ways to mitigate inflation are different depending on whether you have demand push or whether you have supply squeeze. And that can become really important when it comes to debates. Stunning. Impact of inflation. Purchasing power is eroded. Really simple. Purchasing power is how much I can buy with my money. If everything else is getting expensive, then I can buy less things with my money. It also erodes savings. This is super important, such as pensions or rainy day fund, because those things don't grow. Or pensions might grow, but they tend to grow at a slower rate than inflation. So that means those people who have stopped working and maybe can't work because they're old now, they suffer a lot from inflation. And the same with just if I have savings stocked away, those savings might lose a lot of value because when I eventually take them out, the cost of goods and services has increased so much that I can't buy shit anymore. Almost paradoxically, even though purchasing power is eroded, spending tends to increase for some goods and services under inflation because consumers who recognize that their money is less worth tomorrow does that make sense as a sentence? Consumers who recognize that their money is, that should be worth less. Consumers who recognize that their money is worth less tomorrow spend it today. And you might be thinking like, this obviously isn't the case, right? Like if pints are more expensive, I'm not going to buy a ton of pints now. I'm like, okay, probably true. Okay, probably true. But this is typically the case for really large purchases, such as cars or houses, which is like part of the problem with when the news starts to spread that house prices are increasing, because then there's a huge rush to buy houses before the price increases any more so, which causes demand push inflation, which causes the whole cycle to start again. So it's cars, houses, weddings, any big purchases, because even a 1% change of inflation for a $10,000 bill is in the hundreds of euros. So you want to make sure you buy it now before it gets more expensive. Increased supply. This is a fairly easy follow-on from the law of supply, which is say if things are getting more expensive, the supply of that tends to increase. Supply tends to have an positive relationship with price. Therefore, sellers will try and capitalize on an expensive good. Importantly, though, this isn't always the case. Inflation can limit supply through prohibitive costs of production. And you're probably asking yourself, that's contradictory. Which is the real answer? Much like everything, completely up to the debate. You're going to have to give reasons for which is a more persuasive relationship, which is a more persuasive impact of inflation. I studied math, so I've always wanted to do this, but I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader. And then finally, it disrupts long-term planning. Capital investments, such as buildings, roads, hospitals, etc., they could, if like they're planned out decades in advance, say, and of course, like planners aren't stupid, they do incorporate inflation into those plans, but often if it's runaway inflation or unplanned high inflation, that like leads to an increase in costs, which can jeopardize long-term projects. They literally can't be finished now because they don't have the money stocked away. So either they have to go and source more money, or some of them just have to shelve full stop. So inflation sounds pretty bad. So therefore, is deflation good? Nah, not usually. Why is deflation? Because just to be clear as well, deflation is when the price of goods and services decrease over time. So one of the important reasons that supply decreases, sellers don't want to provide a good that is falling in value. So therefore, and because earlier we've talked about how supply is an inherent good, or how maybe we've talked about how it's easy to prove supply is an inherent good. So therefore, if supply decreases, that is an inherent harm by the same logic. Further, sellers who already bought goods to sell stand to make a huge loss, and this can have a follow-on impact because they mightn't be able to pay the wages that month. They might be able to pay on taxes. They might be able to survive as a business, leading to, again, less supply. So what happens so demand increases, kinda. Conventional economic logic obviously says that as prices fall, demand increases. And I would say that is true for day-to-day expenses or luxury expenses, such as like pints. Pints would probably be bought a lot more of if the price of pints fell. But if prices are consistently falling, this can put a halt on spending as people hold off on buying stuff until it becomes cheaper. Again, more prevalent when it comes to big purchases like houses or student loans and stuff. Because if it costs like 10,000 euro to go to university this year, but that's falling, then I might as well hold off in a year and like take out that student loan when it's a bit cheaper. I think this is important because those two things are, again, slightly contradictory. You have people maybe buying more of one good and buying less of another good. So in a debate, again, how do you prove that one good is more important? Again, up to the debate. You just have to give reasons for why maybe people buy more pints, and therefore that represents a bigger portion of the economy. Or maybe you say that because weddings and houses and cars are so expensive, they are more important and should be weighed higher in the debate. Whatever logic you want to use, I think it is necessary if this kind of clash comes up in the debate to just clarify why deflation affects this good more so, and why that's important to take into account. Finally, and probably most importantly, and probably easiest to prove in a debate, deflation leads to investment falling because businesses don't want to establish themselves and hire employees if their goods are only going to decrease in price. Therefore, potential employment opportunities are lost. This is one of the biggest reasons for why it's easy to prove that inflation is actually quite good. For anyone who studied economics, this is why, they try and keep inflation to a steady, predictable level of below 2%, because you want a ton of investment. You want people to be paid for having a job. Exchanging your labor for money is kind of good, actually, because you have to then exchange that money for goods and services. So that's a reason for why you actually don't want deflation. Stunning. So I think, sorry, I don't know if I said, I kind of forgot what the next slide was. We're gonna walk through a motion and tie in how inflation can be used in an argument. So this time we're gonna go with this house believes that the significant rise in retail investing brings more harm than good. I didn't include the definition here. They might have included the info slide. Wait, was there an info slide? There was not. Retail investing is just people buying stocks and shares on their own accord or through vendors such as like Robinhood or Revolut. Google it is my recommendation. Google is going to explain it better than I will in this workshop. Okay, so the steps we ran through for supply and demand are pretty much the same here. Supply, factorize, analyze, impact. Supply. So simplify something really clear in the motion. This rise has led to an increase in demand. That's pretty obvious, right? Like they say themselves in the motion that this is a significant rise in retail investing. Therefore, that represents a demand for stocks and other financial assets. Factorize that. More demand, that increase in demand means an increase in spending on those stocks, because as more people are willing to spend more money, people do spend that money. So therefore, that leads to an increase in spending. An increase in spending causes demand to push inflation, further raising the price of these assets. This is especially true with stocks and some of their goods that are quasi-finite, because like there's not a lot of them you can sell. So you can't sell infinite amounts of them, or they're not like renewable. So therefore demand push inflation hits them even harder. So therefore because we've proven that there's an increase in demand, because we've proven that leads to an increase in spending, because we've proven that increase in spending leads to demand push inflation, we can impact that. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of buyers, meaning that stocks and shares are now more inaccessible because they're a lot more expensive now. Only the rich can buy them, which is to say, it's literally more expensive to get your hands on stocks and shares. And if your debate has come to a consensus that those things are good assets to have, then you have just proven that it's only made accessible to those people who already have money and therefore probably need them the least. There's also a glib response here, right? Like I'm aware there's a glib response, which is to say, look, if the price of stocks and shares goes up, that's fine. You can just sell it. This is going to be a slight tangent. I might include this as a comment on the slides that are sent out. And sure, that argument might work, especially if it's being sold amongst a big chain of people. Like maybe each people make like a tenner as the share price goes up of a stock or something. But ultimately, there is still the hot potato problem, which is to say someone is going to get burnt and cannot sell it. And I think it's fairly trivial to prove in a debate that is a harm more significant than the good of those people making like a tenner or €100 along the way of that share and stock increasing in price. Or I think equally, it's also trivial to make the argument that because a lot of people made a small amount of money, that is more good than one person making a big loss. Stunning. That's an argument for a separate time. Again, exercise for the reader. Okay, stunning. And now we're doing, Oh, sorry. That's not a new slide. I'm just saying, important to say that analyzing the narrative of retail investing can really help land these impacts, right? Because it defines exactly what consumer like what consumer is increasing demand and specifically how that demand has been increased. So it's through the narrative of retail investors subverting the stock market, like being smarter than those bros on Wall Street. And this leads to them making irrational decisions, and maybe demand push inflation happens even more so then, because a ton of people are tricked into thinking they're making really good investments because they're really smart. And this leads to them making bad investments with their already weak purchasing power. Narratives are good. People should use them a lot, especially when it comes to economics debates. So we're going to try OO on the same motion. So simplify, this rise has led to an increase in demand in stocks and other financial assets. Factorize, more demand means an increase in spending on these stocks. Analyze, increase in spending causes demand push inflation, further raising the price of these assets. And these three are the exact same as the other three. The reason I like the supply, factorize, analyze, impact method of generating arguments as well is because you can push back, because it's also useful for characterizing your opponent's arguments as well. If you break your opponent's arguments into digestible points, being simplify, factorize, analyze, and impact, you can disagree on any one of those strands to try and win the debate. But oftentimes it's easier to agree on a lot of strands and then show why your one is significant, why like the impact is different. So for example, the first three steps are the same here, but the impact is different because inflation, that is to say demand push inflation, which we've just proven, and if your OG ran the OG that we just run, you don't even need to prove that. You can just be like, yep, OG ran this, they proved this, we agree with that. So inflation encourages an increase in supply, meaning different brokers will attempt to enter the market in order to satisfy this demand. They will offer more favorable deals. They will offer maybe a more helpful UI. They offer deals to potential retail buyers. And further, potential companies who want to go public might be incentivized to put their stocks available now because there's a lot more people buying stocks and shares. And they might do that by highlighting their business practices or simply by releasing more stock, which would be more valuable now because there's a lot of people looking to buy a lot more stock. So that can be a different impact. And then you would obviously need to weigh why that is more important than the purchasing power being lost on opening government. I'm not going to do that, another exercise for the reader, but I'm just going to run through. This is just an example of how to use the simplify, factor, analyze, impact method to generate arguments related to inflation. I need to come up with a handy acronym, but I don't have one. So if someone else comes up with a handy one, then let me know. Stunning. How to mitigate inflation is an important step. Because oftentimes you're stuck in a policy motion where it's like you have to prove that something makes inflation better, and then maybe as opening opposition, you want the opportunity to run something cool and unique about a different way to mitigate inflation. Here are different ways to mitigate inflation. Legislation. You can very easily and strictly just restrict the purchase of certain goods or put a cap on the price of those goods. So for example, the Irish government implemented a price cap on resale tickets. You now can't resale tickets in Ireland for like more than what you bought them for. It's been quite useful. It means the price of resale tickets has gone down quite a bit. That inflation that was occurring is now just gone. You can improve supply chains. So, and to be clear, like I said earlier, different methods typically work for different types of causes of inflation. So that initial example of Irish government implementing a price cap on resale tickets, that was specifically as a result of demand push inflation. There were a lot of people demanding tickets, primarily because they wanted to resell it. And because that implemented a cap, there's now no longer a demand for that because you can't resell it. So now people don't want it anymore. So yeah, for sure, there's still like under table deals of people reselling tickets for more. But like even the price of those resale tickets have decreased quite dramatically because it's more difficult to do now. So that's a good, maybe not a good, but a good example of how to limit demand push inflation. Secondly, you can just improve supply chain. This is as a response to supply squeeze inflation. Investing in infrastructure and sourcing alternative producers of a good can decrease the costs of production and expand supply. So if there's a ton of grain issues from getting grain from Ukraine to Europe, then maybe find an alternative source for that and invest in the boats that can take that over from other countries faster. That would lead to supply increasing in your economy and hopefully therefore inflation slowing down or a slight bit of deflation happening, which would be good in this case. Providing alternative goods is a really good example and kind of a follow-on from improving supply chains. So if inflation is caused by an overconsumption of one specific good, government can subsidize another alternative good, which then should hopefully decrease demand push inflation. A simplest example of this is if there's a lot of people driving on motorways and the motorways are becoming congested, this isn't even the cost of motorways, but like if overconsumption is making motorways more costly in terms of time and money, you can decrease bus fares in order to decrease demands on car purchases and decrease demands on using that motorway. And obviously a response to this is to say, well, if you subsidize something, you typically tend to cause a slight bit of inflation as well. Because you're pushing up the cost through the demand that the government is now supporting. And I think it's fairly trivial in a debate, not trivial, that's the wrong word. I think it's fairly simple in a debate to argue that like that subsidy might cause inflation, but if there's a massive overconsumption in one good, then it's worth inflating one good slightly more to make it a more viable alternative, as that would lead to deflation in the other good. So finally, you can increase interest rates. And this is the big one. So interest rates determine how worthwhile it is to save money in a bank. If there are high interest rates, I want to save my money in the bank. Increasing interest rates encourages people to save instead of spend, which decreases demand push inflation. That leads us on to the third and final thing in this workshop, which is interest rates. I probably should have stopped and asked for if there was any questions throughout like the thing, but I'll do that at the end. This cool graph is a graph of interest rates throughout, I think it's throughout Europe, with Ireland being the blue line. When I send out these slides, or when the Academy sends out these slides, I've linked that in the comments so you can get a good look at that. Stunning. What are interest rates? Okay, how am I going to do this? I'm going to do this. What are interest rates in practice? What do they represent? And then what are the impacts? So what are interest rates in practice? So you have two types. Interest rates on savings. Interest rates are paid to an account holders by banks, calculated as a percentage of the money held in the account. So a savings account holding €1,000, which features annual 2% interest rate, will pay out €20 to the account holder at the end of the year. That's it. It is the money you gain by holding your savings in a bank. What are the interest? And to be clear, that isn't just consumers. Like commercial banks, such as like Bank of Ireland or AIB, or a non-Irish example, have accounts with the ECB, with the European Central Bank. You can have accounts with the International Monetary Fund, I think. But like you can have there are savings accounts for commercial entities as well as just individual consumers on the streets. Okay, cool. Savings. Secondly, loans, which is probably the more talked about type of interest rates when it comes to debating, which they shouldn't be. Savings interest rates are important, but loans are more talked about. Interest rates are paid by loan holders, that is debtors, the people who take out the loan, to the loan givers, which is creditors, people like bank is the obvious example. They are calculated as a percentage of the principal, which is the initial sum taken out for the loan. So taking out a €1,000 loan with an annual rate of 5% means €50 will have to be paid back the first year, on top of paying back the principal €1,000. So really simply, it is the cost of borrowing money. And again, this isn't just true for individuals on the street. Commercial banks take out loans from the ECB and governments take out loans from other places. Everyone pretty much takes out loans, not just people on the street. So what do interest rates represent? Interest rates represent the price of money. So for savings, the interest rate is how much the bank pays you to access your money. And for loans, the interest rate is how much the bank is charging you so you have access to their money. And you might be thinking now, what do you mean the bank has access to my money? Like, it's my money. I can just take it out of the savings account whenever it happens. And kind of, right? So this is where fractional reserve banking comes into play, which are, I know 3 words out of the blue, but they do make sense. What does it mean for banks to have access to your money? Banks collect deposits from customers and lend out that money to debtors. The more deposits or savings a bank has, the more money they can loan out. The system of deposits, being the funds for banks to lend out money, is called fractional reserve banking. There might be a slight bit of alarm bells going off now for people listening in, because I've talked about the price of money, I've talked about how to access that money, and how the supply of that money might change. And you might be thinking, like, is this just supply and demand all over again? Yeah, it is. Everything is just supply and demand. So importantly, high interest rates mean that the price of money increases. Therefore, consumers are more willing to sell their money to the bank in the form of savings, which is an intuitive way to think about that, even if you can get your savings back. And consumers are, I think important way to land this more intuitively. If you're having difficulty envisioning savings as like things that you give the bank because you can always draw them back, there are certain savings accounts which help visualize this better. There are certain savings accounts which give better returns, but there are certain conditions with those savings accounts. You either have to always keep a minimum amount of money in the bank, or you have to deposit a certain amount of money every month, or you have to deposit money and then you can't withdraw that money for a certain number of years. So in those cases, it's explicit that you're giving the money to the bank and you can't get it back unless a condition is met. And then normal savings accounts are kind of like that. And the bank just kind of relies on a lot of people keeping the money there as opposed to withdrawing it all at once. What do high interest rates mean? It means that consumers are more willing to sell their money and they're less likely to buy money from the bank. Like, this is just supply and demand, right? If the price of money increases, I want less of it and I'm more willing to give it away. This can be considered equivalent to the demand for money within an economy, because high interest rates means demand for money decreases. There's a negative relationship between price and demand, and low interest rates mean demand for money increases. There's a positive relationship between price and demand. So what about money supply? This is trickier. You can't draw a handy supply and demand graph like you can for goods and services. Two main ways, especially in debating, that money supply is talked about. The first way is that interest rates are set by the central banks, which determine commercial rates. So central banks, example, the European Central Bank, lend money to commercial banks, such as Bank of Ireland. And the banks slightly mark up those rates before passing them on to customers. So the ECB makes money available to Barclays at a rate of, like, for €1,000 at a rate of 3%. Then Barclays is likely to turn around and loan that €1,000 to consumers at a rate of 4%. This is a big way in which banks make money. There are often debates where people have stood up and said, I've included this as a comment because this is another side tangent that I want to go on. There have been a lot of debates I've been in where people have said, like, banks can't compete on giving out loans because the rates are set by the ECB. And that's just a bit of nonsense. Like, it is true that the ECB sets limits as to what you can ultimately charge, but there's still absolutely flexibility for commercial banks when it comes to giving out loans. Firstly, they can compete on the rates they give out, but secondly, they can also compete on the time it takes to pay back those rates. That's the analytical way of saying that banks absolutely can compete on the rate of loans. The empirical evidence for this is this graph. Go back and double check it, but you can see that these are the rate of interest rates being charged by banks. And you can see the Ireland one is above the median, which is to say different banks charge people different amounts of money. And they often compete on that. Stunning. Where were we after that rant? Where are we? Okay, stunning. The other way in which supply of money is determined is that the European Central Bank and also the Fed, I believe in America, sets reserve requirements, which dictate how much money can be lent out at any one time. So this is set as a percentage, and banks must hold that percentage of their current liabilities, which is to say the loans they give out, in their ECB account. So they have an account with the ECB. So for example, if a bank has lent out €1,000,000, under the reserve requirement of 1%, it means they must keep €10,000 in their account. And the purpose of this is pretty simple, because you want to make sure that if a lot of people ask for their savings back at the same time, the bank can supply that. Whereas if the bank immediately turns around and always gives away the money it's promised to save, then people can't get their money back, and that is pretty bad. So that's the two main ways in which money supply is determined, but interest rates are the main way in which it's determined. Stunning. So interest rates. Let's talk about the impacts of low interest rates first. You get an increase in lending because money costs less now, and therefore it's cheaper to take out loans. If it was 1% to take out loans last year and now it's 0.5%, I should really take out a loan this year. This is really easy to prove as an inherent good within an economy because it enables people to buy cars, houses, weddings, holidays, etc. Education, really importantly. I think this is super easy to prove as a good within a debate because you can really easily prove that this is life-changing money. Like the ability to secure myself a house, the ability to buy myself the wedding I always wanted, the ability to buy myself education is something that can literally change my future, my entire capacity to earn money, or just enjoyment, like a once-in-a-lifetime enjoyment. Therefore, increase in lending is pretty good. It also leads to an increase in investment. Businesses can now take out loans to expand operations, whether that's taking out a loan to buy a new piece of machinery, whether that's taking out a loan to buy a new premises, or whether that's taking out a loan to like literally build an extension onto the shop so I can serve more customers. It potentially looks like more employment, more tax revenue, etc., which is quite good generally within an economy. It looks like a decrease in savings. Because savings now earn less money, people therefore take their money out of the bank and use it to do other things. Either they'll buy it, they'll spend it on like the house they're buying, they'll spend it on pints, or they'll put it into the stock market and buy stocks, which have a higher return of interest than savings now. Importantly, all of this spending leads to demand push inflation. Higher income as a result of access to more loans leads to demand pushing up prices, which is something that governments tend to want to avoid, and which is why I think for the last while, interest rates have been set quite low as a result of trying to avoid making a lot of money available, which would push up the costs of these things further. So what are the impacts then of high interest rates? First of all, you get an increase in savings. Actually, did I mention it? Oh, sorry. For the decrease in savings, this is slightly these are actions working against each other as well. So savings earn less, which means people take them out of a bank. But because we've literally just talked about how the way banks work, they take those savings and then lend them out. This can potentially lead to less money for the bank to lend out, which almost leads to more demand push inflation as well. Because if you think that in the future, people are going to take their money out of the bank, you know that the bank is only going to be able to make loans available for the next short term, which leads to a lot of people taking out loans in the short term, which leads to demand push inflation getting higher, which leads to like worse consequences as we've talked about before. Again, those are contradictory things. How do you prove them? Easiest way, in my opinion, is to tie in a narrative. But like there are other ways to prove that one factor overrides the other. It usually comes down to time period, like how long the low interest rates exist for. So impacts of high interest rates. Increase in savings. Money costs more now, and therefore savings return more value, which is to say, if high interest rates exist, I would have put €1,000 away and that 1% would have given me a tenner back. But if that's jumped to 5%, I now get €50 back. So I'm going to put more money in my savings account. This increase in savings can lead to banks having more liquidity and more funds for loans. It leads to a decrease in investment because it's now more expensive for businesses to take out money and expand operations. Everything we just talked about previously, them buying new buildings and buying new machinery, they can't do that now. Or at the very least, it's more expensive to now, which leads to, you can prove, leads to an increase in the costs of production, which can also lead to a bit of inflation. It leads to a decrease in spending, especially for big loan-enabled purchases. This can limit or slow down demand push inflation, which is the big logic right now in why the ECB and other central banks are keeping interest rates low, because they don't want a lot of money pushing up the price of goods and services. Sorry, interest rates high because they don't want money pushing up the cost of goods and services. Important to note that financial assets also drop in value relative to savings. So if savings now offer a better investment than financial assets such as stocks, then people will stop buying stocks and start selling them in order to take that money and put it into a savings account, which would give me more return. This can be harmful for business and for stock owners. For stock owners, this is fairly obvious, right? Like I bought a stock a year ago because it's tanked in value now relative to savings. I'm going to lose money when I sell it, and I might as well sell it now because there's no guarantee that it won't decrease further in value as interest rates increase. For businesses and why it's harmful, the very simple idea is that when businesses like to sell stocks, it's a way of getting a lot of money quickly, and it's a way of getting a lot of money without having to pay people back. So if I make stocks available, saying if you buy this share, I think is a better way of phrasing it. If you buy this share, you have some say in how the company is run. then I don't have to pay you back for that, right? You buy the share. Sometimes I have to pay dividends, but not all shares do that. But if so, basically, if the financial assets drop in value relative to savings, businesses have a harder time doing that. They have a harder time making stocks and shares available, which therefore leads to them having to turn to other lines of credit. And because other lines of credit right now in high interest rates, well, not right now, but like right now in the example, and because other lines of credit have high interest rates, this is more expensive, therefore, for them to get money, which leads to the decrease in investment we just talked about. Stunning. Let's do argument generation walkthrough for this one as well. And this is the last one before we wrap up. Well, the last one of two sides before we wrap up. So let's say we're OGing on the motion. This house opposes the strategy of deficit financing by liberal democracies. This is the info slide. I'll let y'all read that in your own time. So let's do generate an argument for this walkthrough. So this house opposes the strategy of deficit financing by liberal democracies. Simplify it. Deficit financing means governments borrow more money. Either they take out more loans or they offer more bonds at a cheaper rate. This is another side tangent. I'm gonna put a pin in, and I've included this as a comment on the slides as well. What are bonds? I don't think a lot of people in debating talk about them accurately. Bonds are an IOU from the government, where they sell you, where they take money off you and they promise to return that money with interest. So if I buy an Irish government bond for €100 at 5%, that means I give the Irish government €100, and in a set period of time, they give me back that €100 with an extra €5 as a result of 5% interest rate. This is a really simple way for governments to borrow from people, because they make bonds available and people buy those bonds, which means the government gets a huge influx of cash right now, and they therefore have to make good on those bonds in the long term. They have to pay back those bonds with interest. This is why, for example, people are quite often debt hawks, and they talk about how, like, oh, countries are so in debt to other countries. And that's true for sure. But for the case with most countries, the people that governments are most often in debt to are their own citizens, because their own citizens take out, like, buy a lot of bonds, and like anyone can buy bonds. So it can be me as an individual consumer, it can be a commercial bank can buy a bond, foreign governments can buy bonds as well, to be fair. But this is just a way of governments borrowing. Sorry, that was a slight tangent, because I haven't seen bonds being talked about really accurately in debating before, and that is all in writing as well when I share out these slides. So back to the argument generalization. Simplifying. Either the government takes out more loans from commercial banks or from elsewhere, or they offer more bonds. Borrowing more money represents an increase in demand for that money. Lenders will capitalize on this because governments have to go somewhere to get that money. They can go to the European Central Bank, but often, and other central banks, but often those central banks are the lenders of last resort, which means they will only lend you the money if you have proven that you've taken significant steps to try and find money from other sources. So before that, most governments have to go to commercial banks. And commercial banks, or they have to go to other governments as well. And lenders will capitalize on this increase in demand and will increase prices as a result. Because they know that this government wants this money a lot, they will increase the interest rates because that demand exists. This looks like increasing interest rates and or limiting the time by which governments can pay back the loans. There's an important burden to prove here, which is to say, if a government is doing deficit financing and they go to banks or they go to other governments for loans, why does that increase in interest rates affect everyone, not just the government? The reason is pretty simple, because governments, when they source credit, have to compete with other governments and other commercial institutions. So if the Bank of Ireland is approaching, if the Bank of Ireland is approaching AIB, for example, a different commercial bank for a loan, the government might also be approaching AIB at the same time. So AIB can compete can raise interest rates and know that either the government will pay that or Bank of Ireland will want that money and pay that instead. So that is why when governments do deficit financing, typically interest rates increase for everyone, not just governments. So what have we done so far? We've simplified it. We've identified that this means they borrow more money. We factorize it. That means that leads to a factor which is an increase in demand for money, and we've analyzed it. That increase in demand leads to increased prices for money. In this case, that increase in prices is interest rates. I'm only noticing now the top of the slide says inflation. That shouldn't be the case. It should say interest rates, but regardless. What is the impact then? The impact is an increase in interest rates leads to a decrease in investment and savings, as we've just talked about. No, that's wrong. Sorry, that should say, apologies. That should say an increase in interest rates leads to a decrease in spending. It leads to an increase in investments in savings because, again, savings return you more money. So that means, and so therefore people will save instead of spend. This is really harmful for an economy which is trying to stimulate spending, because in a deficit, you want people spending money, which you can tax. And if people save instead, that's really harmful. Okay, stunning. Let's OO it then. So now we're supporting the strategy of deficit financing by liberal democracies. Simplify it. Deficit financing means governments borrow more money. Either they take out loans or they offer more bonds at a cheaper rate. Exact same step as the last one. Factorize. Borrowing money represents an increase in demand for money. Again, same as the last one. Lenders will capitalize this and increase in demand and increase prices. Again, exact same as the last one. But finally, you impact it differently. You say an increase in interest rates leads to an increase in savings, which, to be fair, did I have a... Yeah, that's the correct one. An increase in investment rates do lead to an increase in savings. This can provide financial security to many consumers and ensures that banks now have enough liquidity so that bank runs are prevented. Bank runs are pretty much when the economy is doing poorly, a lot of money will lose faith in financial institutions and they will run to the bank to take their money out of the bank. If a lot of people do this at the same time, then the bank pretty much fails and can't pay back their debtors and the economy as a whole suffers. So if you have an increase in savings, you have a lot more money flowing into a bank and therefore bank runs are much more difficult. I was going to say pull off, like no one really pulls them off, but they're a lot more difficult to actually lead to. They're better protected from bank runs. Yes.
So I'm finding like a lot of this stuff seems like really like theory, like theoretical, but also like I feel like oftentimes like kind of like you're saying the impacts contradict themselves. So is like one way, for example, to sort of differentiate or make your case more likely, explain like nuance in terms of both groups do things. So i.e. like the savings and bank runs kind of sound contradictory because people are putting their money in or they're taking it out. So would it just be like maybe regular like individuals are the ones who are saving, and then like institutions and like rich businesses and stuff are the ones that are like acting in different ways, and then you can not be analysis. Is that like how you sort of differentiate those things? Or...
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll repeat it for the Zoom in case that wasn't caught, which is to say a lot of this is very theoretical and a lot of this seems to have contradictions. Like, would one way of differentiating this talk about the different groups in society? So, for example, the increase in interest rates, increase in savings leading to bank runs seems to be contradictory, right? Like, if there's an increase in savings, why would people be running to take their money out from the bank? Would it be easier to therefore prove that like one group increases their savings and this leads to the panicked group not doing a bank run? And yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of proving it, right? Like, I think you can prove that maybe there are more people who pay attention to certain like financial news and they put their savings, and the people who like pay attention to right-wing crank websites who say like, oh, the end is now, they are the ones who maybe run to financial institutions and take their money out. But because one group has been saving, that means that bank run is much better protected. I think differentiating the exact types of population that are affected by each trend is definitely a way to prove it. And importantly, like I've been saying from the start, you have to tie in the narrative to each, like why is the narrative different for each group, and why is maybe one narrative more overriding than the other, and pretty much that lets you diversify your impacts as well. I would say as well, important thing to note, these argument generations, they are quite simple, and I don't think any one of these is enough to have a speech on their own. The idea of this argument generation is that you simplify as many factors in the info slide as possible. So if we run all the way back to the really wordy word vomit one. So example, if we run back to this one, the idea of doing the simplify, factorize, and analyze impact is that you would ideally do that with every example listed in the info slide, because that way you not only diversify your argument so that if one argument is taken down, you have 3 more left standing, but it also means that like you can cover the economic impact like to the best degree in which, like to the most holistic degree of the economy. I would argue that you do that for, if it's a word vomit motion, do that for every type of example that's listed in the motion, or at least very least attempt to. And I would push you to not only do that for the examples on your side. So for example, if it's Haykian instead of Keynesian, do it for the examples listed under the Haykian, but also do it for the examples listed under the Keynesian, but obviously prove why those are bad as opposed to good, or vice versa if you're on the other side of the motion. I really like word vomit motions sometimes because it really simplifies prep time. Like, you know what you have to talk about because it's been literally listed by you. It's been literally listed by the CAs. And then you can tie it into the different consumers. Maybe some of these examples affect different consumers at different rates, and different parts of the economy are affected at different times, or to different impacts. And then you can weigh those off against each other and say that why it's so much more harmful on this side or so much better on this side. It's all, even if it's not a word vomit motion, though, even if it's just like, this house supports raising interest rates, which is a really boring one, but it's one that is run a lot. I would argue you should do it for every. You should run that simplify, factorize, analyze impact for every factor we've talked about today. Not everyone on every slide, but like if it's interest rates, I would say like do it for like all the factors that affect it, but also all the impacts as well. So do the simplify, factorize, analyze impact for every impact and factor of interest rates or inflation or supply and demand that you can think of. Stunning. I think that is me finished. So any questions? Yes.
Japan had a 0% interest rate for a while, right? Why would they want that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they actually dipped into. Oh, sorry. To repeat the question. The question was Japan had a 0% interest rate for a while. Why would they do that? I think actually they went worse. Not worse. I think they went more extreme. I think they had a negative interest rate for a while. I think the ECB also had negative interest rates for some types of savings as well. The idea is pretty much you want to punish savings. If you really, really want people to spend, you don't want anyone saving anything. You also want a ton of demand. So basically, you would make interest rates negative if you want to put rocket fuel into the economy. Because then loans don't cost anything, or at the very least, like there might be service fees or transaction fees. But like if the interest rate on a loan is minus 10%, that means that on a loan that I'm taking out for €1,000, I only have to pay back €900. So the reason why you would have negative interest rates or 0% interest rates is to really add fire into economy that is maybe like literally has no demand in it whatsoever. So that would be a reason for why you do negative interest rates. And then obviously there's like harms in there being like, you might want to add rocket fuel to a fire, but like fires spread, man. Like I don't know if you want offering negative interest rates and having like everyone take out loans, because a lot of them probably won't pay it back. Because you open it up to people who mightn't be used to paying back loans, or just like you open it up to so many consumers that a higher percentage of them are going to default than usually expected or predicted. Look, it's up to the debate why that would be good or bad. Again, this is an image that I saw that I looked up when Googling economics questions. So hopefully this workshop has made you like this dude who was thinking about money and now has thinking about more money. Okay, stunning, fantastic. I think that is me finito. The slides should be sent along in due time. I'll try add in any comments about the clarifications that I had to make throughout it. I'll try relook over this, see the clarifications I had to make the most, and then add them in. So thanks a million, y'all, and shalom.